hrozně rád s Danem chodím na...
You know, I like going to conferences with Dan because he always comes up with new figures which I can then use in my own presentations later on. Díky. Dan, as I've said, showed a lot of figures. I also want to show figures, and after having done that, I will concentrate on causes and impact. My view graphs and charts are not as nice, but they are sort of livable. You've seen these figures. These are 2017 figures, which I always start with because they quite well illustrate the scope of the problem. And we all know that we've been trying to change the situation, the number of execution orders, etc., and the changes are not going in the right direction. 830,000 people under enforcement orders in this country, 3.4% increase as opposed to 2016. People under insolvency procedures are about 80,000. So debt relief is undergo with 80,000 people. Every other person, every other member of this group, of this big group in the society has more than 5 enforcement orders, plus tax and administrative orders are not included. So you may have enforcement orders from the medical insurance from your municipality for not paying for whatever waste and any other administrative fees. So it's not included into these figures. Last year, less enforcement orders have been implemented, only 600,000, only in inverted commas. It's about 20% less than the year before, and 540,000 of enforcement orders implemented. So more orders are initiated than those concluded. And at the moment, we have about 5 million orders in this country of 10 million population. But what's much worse is that many of these people are facing more enforcement orders. 500,000 3+ orders, 150,000 people 10+ enforcement orders. 135,000 retirement pensioners are also facing enforcement orders on their pensions. 240 billion Czech crowns are being every year enforced by enforcement orders. So this is only debt collection. It does not include any of the interest rates and anything else. It's just the fundament of it. You know, people who whose debt is equivalent to €4 can end up paying €1,000. But what's included is only the €4. 20,000 of debt relief proposals, so as we call it, insolvency proposals. And should there be new, even if we say that there won't be any people in the future applying, it's quite a lot. This will take 20 to 30 years to solve. So, in figures in detail, 70% of indebted individuals are facing more than one enforcement order. Oftentimes, the enforcement order actually ends up in these people becoming heavily indebted. Their account gets frozen, their property cannot be sold or anything else, and they fall into secondary indebtedness. They stop paying for their rent, utilities, etc., and they end up facing more and more enforcement orders, and then they usually give up on it and just end up really badly. And then their voting preferences are what they are, because these people are frustrated, they're pushed to the corner, they blame the system for it, and they start voting for anti-systemic movements. The number of people facing more than 10 enforcement orders, 150,000, 6,000 people with over 20 enforcement orders, and then you have about 600 people with facing multiple dozens of orders, and they don't pay for anything. They don't do anything. They laugh at the police when the police find them, because they will never pay for it, and it ends up with the society paying for it. Looking at the age distribution of people facing executions, a serious debt enforcement problem, that's 3+ enforcement orders. So we simplified it by talking about people facing 3+. The second, there are 400 kids facing more than 3 orders. There are 6,000 kids at the moment facing enforcement orders. It could be 7-year-olds. It's crazy. It's very specific for this country. People over 18, 59,000 of them facing 3+ orders. Many of them facing 10+. The second end. The other end, senior people, 28,000 senior citizens, 3+ enforcement orders. Their pension is limited, it's clear, and debt relief conditions are so complex that these people will never be able to reach to that. They're sort of caught in debt for good till the end of their life. This view graph shows how absurd the system is. Of 5 million orders, 50% of them are concerned people who have 10+ orders. And these are irrecoverable, really. Maybe the creditor number 1 can get some money back, but the rest is just helpless. 40%, 3 to 9 enforcement orders can never be recovered. So 80 to 90% of enforcement orders cannot be executed. And plus the creditors have no chance, and the debtors equally have no chance. Their lives are ruined. Looking at the number of enforcement orders is one thing, but what's even more serious is the number of enforcement orders per person, and also the regional distribution of numerous enforcement orders. Prague, Mladá Boleslav are the best. But you see regions to northwest are rather troublesome. But the distribution of numerous execution orders is about equal in the country. The structure is about the same. Northwest, there are more people in debt, but apart from that, people who are quite well off and people who are sitting at the very bottom, the same problems, multiple enforcement orders. It's interesting to look at this map and compare it with data gathered from our foreign counterparts. The Chamber of Debt Collectors and other institutions have tried to collect data from abroad, IMF, European Commission, etc. None of these institutions actually have statistics. All statistics focus on overdebtedness or numbers of debt relief proceedings, but not the number of enforcement orders per person, for example. Many countries pay increased attention to free enforcement order proceedings, a collection of debt before it comes to court. In this country, it's extreme. 5 million enforcement orders. As to household indebtedness, it's not as bad. Looking at our indebtedness, we are number 5 under the average in the EU. So it's not bad. If you look at tests comparing Czechs to citizens of other countries in Europe, testing their financial literacy, it's not bad either. So what's behind the 5 million of enforcement orders? You could have seen the big article on poverty in the Czech Republic at one of the leading dailies, which makes a good analysis of the root cases of indebtedness in this country. It's interesting. Read it. 4 things are behind it. First, non-banking sector, which was not regulated in the 90s. Non-bank loans were under the supervision of Czech Trade Inspection. There were many entrepreneurs who borrowed money from banks to provide for consumer loans. Many people did not understand what it is. 2,000 to 3,000 people didn't borrow more, so it's 100 euro. And the whole business was not built on interest rates, but on sanctions for failure to pay. These companies, really the providers of consumer loans, they build their business around enormous sanctions for delayed payments or failure to pay. These companies were lending money to everybody, to unemployed people, single mothers, indebted people. They knew they were going to recover it somehow. Regulations concerned debts over 5,000 crowns only. So most sums, unregulated sums, were under 5,000, or all irregulated sums were under 5,000 because it was regulated only from 5,000 up. In December 2016, a new act came to force which now regulates all loans, not only those below 5,000. There is also one new piece of legislation which was to simplify collection of debt and fees collected by debt collectors. So this bylaw actually stipulated how much money a debt collector could charge. Unfortunately, debt collectors could collect 20,000 crowns in debt collecting fees for a loan of 10 crowns. So 10 crowns to 20,000. And that was legal fees, collector's fees, all types of fees. So from 10,000 crowns owed to the creditor, it became 20,000. So irrecoverable debt was sold for much less than the nominal value. For example, people fined by people who took public transportation without paying and they got fined. They were supposed to pay 800 crowns and ended up paying 15,000 crowns. Including debt collector fees and etc. So debt collectors started collecting their fees instead of recovering debt. And there was a new field of business, collecting not debt, but collecting fees from collecting debt.
Luckily, the Constitutional Court has in many other cases intervened. And with a huge push from the non-profit sector, from the civil society, which has been drawing attention to this for years, eventually put an end to this. Then the famous arbitration, which was hijacked to legalize various malpractices. So what couldn't be pushed through regular judiciary was done via arbitration. When you took out a loan, you signed a contract with an arbitration clause that if in the event of a dispute on default, non-payment, etc., the matter will end up not in court but in or before an arbitrator. And again, through the arbitration platform, many sanctions, a huge volume of cases has been done. And again, the courts, the highest court and the Constitutional Court, after many years of campaigning, eventually succeeded at banning or outlawing arbitration clauses in this type of contract. I mean, if it were not for arbitration, then we would have had, 2/3 of the enforcement orders that we have today. And another problem was that Tomáš Sokol, Petr Němec, and a bunch of other lawyers penned legislation to suit their own business interests. So as a result, we now have many people who have multiple judgments and enforcement orders against them. And if you have multiple procedures, then you're paying multiple fines. It goes through many various institutions. And for instance, if you employ someone who's got multiple enforcement orders against them, then you have to communicate, because of wage deductions, you have to communicate with 15 different counterparties, it's not so much about calculating the wage deductibles, because a computer will do that for you, but this whole multilateral communication is very cumbersome, and obviously the person, the victim, then has to pay many fees in multiples, even though the steps in the procedure are identical. Today, at about 11 o'clock, the Private Party at a press conference unveiled a proposal to introduce the so-called territoriality, geographical territoriality, or geographical territorial competence of debt collection offices. This has been mulled over for many years. Nobody has had the courage to propose it as a bill, not even in the first draft, to the parliament. So we wish the best of luck to the Pirate Party, because this is much called for. It's not the whole debt collection, or debt collector community, which is the problem. There are many who do the profession a great disservice and a bad name, because there are individuals who are really unscrupulous and unethical, and they tarnish the whole debt collection profession with the same brush. So the territorial competence or jurisdiction means that if you live somewhere, even if you have multiple judgments and execution orders, it will all fall to the same debt collector. That eliminates at least the excessive burden of coordination and communication. Plus, there are what we call unregulated collection agencies, which often inflated the debt collection fees. This is one example for all. The original amount of loan, 50,000 crowns. The client was to repay 25,000. He did not. Within days, the debt grew to 417,000. The contractual penalty now being 300,000 crowns from the original loan of 15,000. It was arbitration clause type facility. The most recent legislation gives us the power to retrospectively hold the procedure, which we did, but the debt collector refuses to. I will not name. I cannot name, but refuses to return what they had already collected. Which, even though the debt has not been paid in full, it has been. The amount collected to date is vastly excessive of the original debt. So now the sanction can be 100% of the original amount owed. 50% of the original amount owed. Maximum 200,000. They put a ceiling on it, 200,000. So under the present laws, a loan of 50,000, the maximum contractual penalty could be 7,500, so 50% of the original amount. But cases like this would get you in the debt spiral. You just fail to return 30,000 and suddenly you're stuck with a debt of 500,000. Usury, payday lending. It is often mentioned in connection with RPSN and financial literacy terms, but usury is exploiting somebody's distress for one's own enrichment. It's not only about charging too high an interest. According to our official statistics, it seems that payday lending or usury is not a problem here. You see many regions report, the court statistics report no registered cases implicating payday lending or usury. It was on a nationwide scale, it's about 20 cases for the whole of the country. In the United States, they decided to tackle the problem slightly differently. I selected this case because it's not just a common variety loan shark. It's a famous man, a known personality who had a booming payday lending business. You could compare him to Beran or Kellner. And he was put behind bars in the United States on charges of usury. He was sentenced to 16 years and 8 months in prison and forfeiture of all his assets. So this should be a deterrent case, because the poor are not here to be made money on. But people often argue, well, everybody has its own part of blame because they've signed it, they took out a loan. Well, to that I say, who hasn't installed an app or clicked on a website prompting you to you have to agree with the terms and conditions? You just tick the box and go on. And what if suddenly you end up owing tons of money to someone just because you ticked the box? So contract law should define some minimum levels of trust that you cannot be stitched up with some hidden charges. For instance, I'm an economist by profession, and I've read contracts of 15 pages or more, who which even I couldn't read. Or understand, let alone somebody with elementary education. What if there is a park where there are robbers and evil gangs? Well, would you fence off the park and tell people not to go there, or would you go into the park with the police and reinstate order? So that's what I say on the subject of victimization. Now, who is comfortable with the present situations? We have 150,000 people who have multiple, 10 or more enforcement orders against them. Well, the state profits quite nicely. But obviously the state also has to pay for those people's health care, social benefits, prison service, etc. We have the highest reoffending rates in Europe. If you're sentenced to prison and you emerge the prison with a ton of debt on your back, what will you do? You're probably going to continue your criminal career. So who else can be profiting from this? Judiciary? Hardly, because the courts are saddled with huge volumes of trivial enforcement cases. Debt collection professions? well, perhaps they have certainly tons of work to do, but with enforcement orders piling up, even debt collectors have to join the queue and wait what's left, and they already know very well that there'd be nothing left from the earlier enforcement orders. The large debt collection offices are very comfortable with the situation, on the other hand, because they want the situation to get worse to squeeze out the small competition and monopolize the market. Does it benefit employers? Certainly not, because employers have, when they employ somebody with enforcement orders against them, the just managing or administrating that person's personnel agenda is much more complicated. And the people are not motivated to work because they have most of their salary taken away from them. Does it suit banks? Does the present situation suit banks? Certainly not. There is a huge volume of administration, so sending letters, requests, etc., back and forth. So, does the situation benefit the creditors? Certainly not. The creditors have very little hope of recovering their money. There is a limit beyond which you cannot go with the enforcement, and the people will never have anything more to repay their debt. Does it benefit the job centers, job offices? Well, we can throw billions on the active employment policy, but those people are very hard to motivate to work, because even if they work their heads off, they'll never have any more money. Does the situation suit local governments, local entrepreneurs? Certainly not, because if the population is poor, there is limited market on the local scale, limited appetite to buy products and services locally. So the situation largely does not favor anyone. Even politicians have been recently targeting the enemy, so to speak. Does the situation suit civil debt counselors? No, or citizens bureaus that provide counseling for people in debt? Certainly not. Not even the debt relief and debt cancellation which exists here is in practice not within the reach of most people who are truly in debt because of the 30% requirement. And the citizens' advice bureaus, the only thing they can do is they can work with the people somehow on a psychological level and softly make them understand that the situation or the circumstances will not change until they die, basically. Maybe the Czech post office that delivers the huge amount of letters, enforcement orders and the related administration is the only one that stands to benefit from the situation. People often complain about our financial literacy being very low, but there is very little done to improve it. I had to resort to foreign research to calculate indirect costs of excessive debt. Divorce, worse health, forced relocation, etc. the sample group was high or numerous, and the UK cost was 8.3 billion or in terms of indirect costs of problem debt. So we should realize that this problem is one that affects all of us in one way or another. And the Brits also calculated that every pound invested in debt counselling comes back 12 times or yields 12 pounds. The amendment of the insolvency legislation should make debt cancellation or debt relief available to everyone. Even Poland and obviously Germany, Austria and Slovakia have done away with the threshold. Only we have the 30% threshold, which prevents people from reaching debt cancellation. Austria had, amongst our neighboring countries, Austria had a 10% requirement up until last year, and they abandoned even that. People often argue that why should they pay for somebody else's debt? But we are paying already. We are all paying and bearing the cost of direct and indirect costs. And when you look at it through the optics of economy, when a limited company, a commercial company folds, then the average yield for creditors is about 7%. For enforcement orders, is about 80%. And if you let people, if you allow people to cancel their debt, then the recovery is average 56%, and the people who enter debt cancellation and insolvency do not declare themselves insolvent to trick someone. They just want their situation to be resolved. And debt cancellation gives them the end of the tunnel, the glimmer of hope. And those who are hovering around the 30% mark, it's about 1/3 of them. They just cannot afford to pay more, and they do what they can just to reach those 30%. And the other group are the people who play this 30% mark in order to avoid paying anything.
These people should be sanctioned, really. Debt relief should be terminated, and proceedings should be terminated in this case. But from what I know, there are very few people who actually abuse the system. Abuse of insolvency or debt relief is no longer helpful, really, because it used to be 70% these people could actually save, or better say, not pay. Now it's only 30%. Plus, once you've gone through insolvency proceedings, you can never borrow again. Many people think that people who've gone through insolvency proceedings keep borrowing money on and on and on, but it's not true. If you are borrowing money, you must look into the credit rating of the person, and if you see that they've gone through insolvency, you will never lend them any money. What we need to do is to complete the Insolvency Act amendment to just say history is history. the debt business is over with and start all over again. Even if we manage to promote the amendment in its current wording, it will take a while before the situation calms down. Still, it will be very strict. What we need to adopt is the local competences of debt collectors. All MPs tell us that they are under heavy pressure of lobbyists not to introduce this change. Financial literacy can also help. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to teach children about something what you've never been taught yourself. Teachers don't have any methodology, any guidelines. Oftentimes, they invite a financial expert over to the school to present whatever to the kids, and that's it, done. Financial education done for this year. But that's not enough, of course. We need teachers who are experts in financial literacy and who can present the basics to students and pupils. Czech National Bank and its perception of non-banking institutions is also very important. There are 85 licensed non-banking institutions in our country at the moment. The bank has to oversee that properly and regulate them properly. Many lenders are now outside the regulated market, outside any kind of regulation. The Czech National Bank must supervise them as well. Many entities found semi-legal ways of avoiding the law. They establish or incorporate LTDs. When they get fined, they close the LTD, open a new one overnight. The true owners are never disclosed. It's very difficult. What we also need to change is the civil code of proceedings, and there should be fees, court fees introduced for the initiation of debt collecting proceedings, because creditors initiate proceedings even in respect of multiple debtors where the chance for debt collection is close to zero. So this is it for me. For the first time in my life, I actually managed to keep with the time reserved for my presentation. Should you wish to know more about the history of debt business, there will be a big debate tonight with experts for Man in Need, Czech Banking Association, the chief economist. I'll be there as well, and we'll be talking about what caused this extreme indebtedness of Czech households. It starts at 7 o'clock at Karlín Barracks. We've got 8 minutes for the debate. You've taken more time than scheduled, but it was interesting. It was interesting. I didn't want to stop you. So let's use the 8 minutes to ask questions or make comments, share your experience, please.